book, your agenda book, is the board policies and procedures. The changes are included in red. So if you want it to follow along,
Why don't you repeat that, so?
Okay, so it starts on page 7, and we made some edits there at Chairman Stedman's request on not accepting certain things from institutions of higher education for events and so forth, and ensuring that, or encouraging board members to pay for tickets as in lieu of receiving comp tickets. So you'll see the language there, and I believe that Bill Franz worked with some board members on the language. Bill, is that correct?
I did, and actually, this agenda item, Mr. Steen, you may recall, we were going to try to craft language at the last meeting, but it then became a little more complex than we could do on the fly. And so I worked with Mr. Plank and Mr. Raven shortly after that meeting, and among the three of us, we came up with the language that you see in front of you.
And just, I mean, it is recommended, it's not
That is
required,
correct.
which I think is
the
appropriate.
language-
You know, they can, because the law is clear, it's okay as long as the institution representative is there.
That is correct.
Just for the record, could you sort of explain it, or should we read it into the record?
Sure. Well, either way. What's your preference?
Well, just explain to us again
Okay.
what was done.
The three of us, in devising this language, decided that any ticket, not just football tickets or basketball tickets, which would be perhaps the most common form of admission to an event hosted by an institution, but any ticket for which it normally would carry a cost of admission is allowed to be accepted by a board member so long as a representative of the institution is present during the event. But then we went on to say that it is recommended that board members who intend to accept such a ticket should request an invoice for and pay the base value of the tickets for that event. And that's the gist of the change. And again, it is recommended. It's not a directive that must be followed.
Any questions about that? And then what else do we have?
The next change is on page 10, and this was also added at the request of Chairman Stedman to include a process for which the board evaluates the Commissioner of Higher Education and the Director of Internal Audit and Compliance to ensure that we don't miss that every year. So we incorporated a process for which the board secretary shall work with the Human Resources Director and providing that performance appraisal forms for both positions, to disseminate them no later than June 1 of every year, so that at the July AOC meeting and board meeting, that this can be discussed by the board members.
Yeah, Mr. Steen, what I realized is we can't, the staff needs to come from the staff and not from a chairman of a committee or the chairman of the board. So in other words, it's just a process that happens, that it goes to all the board members because we didn't do the commissioner's evaluation partly because of his announcement, but then the commissioner reviewed Mr. Pale, and I just thought it was important to have the full board weigh in on both positions. But that it's quite burdensome to have either chairman of AOC or chairman of the board to do all the mechanical stuff. So that's what this hopefully solves.
So just a question, what do we do in terms of evaluating the general counsel?
That is actually removed. If you look at page 15, we strike general counsel so that the commissioner, since the general counsel works really directly with the commissioner on a daily basis, we had that the commissioner would be performing that appraisal.
Well, isn't it, and John, you could weigh in on this. I think there's maybe a little bit of a distinction. I mean, as an attorney, Bill, I mean, Mr. Franz, you have certain duties of loyalty, I mean, to the board that I'm not sure really change much depending on who actually reviews you. If you could comment on that. Is the general counsel different than the commissioner or the internal auditor?
The commissioner and the internal auditor are different in this sense, that statutorily, the board is directed to oversee their performance. And of course, you're also dealing with their compensation. The general counsel is not encompassed by statute in that same type of analysis.
I see. So,
I've had a pretty long history in state government, and I've actually been in situations, I can't talk about them in detail, but where we've had a real problem with to emphasize, it's not the coordinating board. So this is something years ago, but we had a problem where the board had an issue with the executive director, and the general counsel was basically so loyal to the executive director that he had to be removed from the process, and we had to bring in somebody from the Attorney General's office. And I tell that story because we want to make sure that the general counsel he's not the lawyer for the executive director. I'm talking about another agency, but he's the general counsel for the board and the actual agency.
well, I would.
So having us evaluate him and being involved in that is a way to emphasize that.
And the general counsel for the coordinating board should always be the general counsel for the entire agency, not simply for an executive director or a commissioner. And I don't know what agency you have reference to, and I'm not asking, but presuming that that statutory enactment setting up that agency, I've not seen one where a general counsel is only the general counsel for an executive director. So I'm not familiar with that.
No, that's not the way it should have been, but that's the way it developed. And the reason that can develop is if the general counsel feels like he or she is working so closely with the executive director, and the executive director is evaluating them and setting their salary and everything else, you can see how that the idea of loyalty kind of can get blurred there. We had the lawyer that was involved was a very good lawyer, but he just kind of, in my mind, he got kind of confused by things. He was defending the executive director, and when we as the board had an issue. And so we had to get him to step aside. But at that agency, then we after that we shifted, and just to emphasize that the general counsel, I think in our organizational chart we had the solid line going to the board, and a dotted line going to the executive director, and then we in turn evaluated and also I believe set the salary and everything else for the general counsel. so.
Yeah, I would like
Yeah,
to, go ahead.
No, I would be fine with doing that, adding general counsel in there as having the board responsible for reviewing it, as long as the mechanical stuff came from the staff, so it just didn't burden, so we didn't have it on our list.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I'm fine with it as,
Well, I feel strongly, like Mr. Steen on page 15, not striking the general counsel. And I think that the commissioner, internal auditor, and the general counsel should be reviewed by the board, is my recommendation.
What we can do is for tomorrow, since this is on the agenda for tomorrow, we'll make the change. We'll unstrike the general counsel on page 15, and then we'll add the general counsel in with the other changes on page 10 and 11.
Thank you, Doctor. Any other questions or comments?
Doesn't this require approval?
It does.
It does.
Yeah, and with that change?
Yes.
So I'll make that motion with that change.
Motion by Mr. Stedman,
With that change, I'll make a second.
second with Dr. Frias. Any further discussion or questions? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Let's see. The next item under agency operations is the consideration of adopting the Commissioner's recommendation to the committee relating to a proposed new subsection to Chapter 1, Subchapter A, Section 1.16 of Board Rules concerning agency administration, contracts, including grants for materials and/or services. Mr. Bill Franz will be available for questions. Mr. Franz, could you come forward and just give us a brief summary of this?
This modification to Board Rule 1.16 is on, you will find it on page 4 of this agenda item, and it is the very last item, and it basically is to the effect that agency staff shall utilize the agency's procurement and contract management handbook guidelines, as well as the risk assessment tool that we developed to determine which contracts require enhanced monitoring, so that the staff in the divisions responsible for monitoring any particular grant are kept abreast of how any particular contract or grant is progressing. There should never be surprises late in the process.
All right, and we received no comments regarding the amendment to these rules.
And, Mr. Chairman, I just want to note that the handbook was put together in response to an internal audit that found some deficiencies in the way that we do contracts and monitor contracts, right? I mean,
Well, no,
handbook?
it was required by statute.
oh, I'm sorry, yes. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of something else.
Yeah,
But we
no,
also had an internal audit that pointed out some deficiencies, and we have much more robust training for contract management.
Yes, for all the folks in the divisions that monitor grants or contracts, that was
agency.
what the internal audit focused on, and that's what the training is designed to address.
Got it.
The handbook itself was brought about because of a recent statutory change.
Thank you.
All right, any questions or comments? I'll need a motion then.
Second.
Okay, motion to approve is made by Dr. Faria, seconded by Mr. Stedman. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. The last item under agency operations is an update on the board's budget priorities for the 86th legislative session. This item does not require any action. Ms. Battles will provide the committee with the latest update on the board's budget in the House and Senate appropriations bills. Ms. Battles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be working off of these two documents. One's a spreadsheet, and the other one's a table. And for those who are in the audience, we have some extra copies up here. For those following online, we do have these posted on our website if you'd like to follow along. So we're currently at the process in the legislative session when budget leaders are making their final decisions on House Bill 1, which is the general appropriations bill for the 2020-2021 biennium. And both the House and Senate chambers have adopted their version of House Bill 1, and conference committee members have been appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker. The conference committee met very briefly yesterday to receive a high-level overview from the LBB staff on the major funding differences between the House and the Senate version. And that's really what the focus of the conference committee is to look at those differences and decide which one, how to rectify those differences. They also announced the members that will be in charge of the work by article. So Senator Taylor and Representative Greg Bonin will be in charge of Article 3, which includes both public and higher education. So these committee members will begin meeting, and they do meet behind closed doors, so we're not exactly sure how their decision-making is done. And so we will then find out towards the end of the process when they do have a public meeting and announce their decisions. So in the meantime, we are going to be requesting meetings with Senator Taylor and Representative Bonin to provide them with our recommendations related to our budget. So the spreadsheet includes all of our budget strategies broken down by goals, and just to note that goals A and B represent our administrative funding strategies, and goals C through I represent funding that we distribute externally to eligible institutions and students and other entities to help support statewide programs and initiatives. On the spreadsheet, you'll see the blue column represents the House version of House Bill 1, and the pink column represents the Senate version. The next column includes our recommendations to the conference committee, followed by a notes section. The green on this spreadsheet indicates the conference committee items. Those are the differences between the House and the Senate. And we've highlighted the amounts that we are going to be recommending to the conference committee members. The yellow highlights are those items where we requested additional funding through our exceptional item requests, but neither House nor Senate adopted in Article 3. But the House did adopt all of our exceptional items in Article 11, which you'll recall is the wish list. This means that there is a possibility that the legislature could find funding to support some of those items. But again, that's a very highly unlikely thing. But again, we're not closing the door on those items. So out of the 15 exceptional item requests that we included in our legislative appropriations request, 9 have either been fully funded or partially funded in Article 3. So I'd like to just quickly walk you through some of these items, beginning with Goal A. So you'll see Strategy A1-4, Academic Quality and Workforce. So the Senate includes $50,000 that we asked to help cover for travel costs for faculty members who are coming from rural institutions to come to Austin to participate in our Fields of Study advisory committees. So obviously, we are recommending that they adopt the Senate version of that item. Strategy A15, under strategic planning and funding, the Senate included $230,000 of our $270,000 exceptional item request, and this would pay for the fees for access to out-of-state student data from the National Student Clearinghouse. And this is going to really help us, give us a much more robust, add to our already robust data center to be able to tell the full picture of how we're doing in terms of educating our population and how many are actually leaving and coming back to Texas. The next one is Strategy A19, which is the Texas Mental Health Care Consortium. You'll recall this was in our introduced version. It's $100 million contingent on Senator Nelson's Senate Bill 10. And this is simply pass-through money. So we're not required to provide any additional administrative support for this consortium. So they're just parking the money here, and then we're going to distribute it based on how the consortium tells us to. Going on to Goal B, you'll see Strategy B12, which is information resources. We're recommending the House version because it fully funds our exceptional item request of $1.04 million for our IT portfolio application modernization. And it also adds 2 FTE to accomplish this work. So the Senate version just cut it in half. So half of the request and 1 FTE to do the work. The Strategy B13 facility support includes in the Senate bill $150,000 to help us cover the potential extension of our building lease if we're required to move downtown to the new buildings that are being built there for state agencies. We haven't received definitive indication that we will, but they're shooting for 2023. Our building lease expires in 2020, so I believe the Texas Facilities Commission has worked with the landlord here to extend our lease on an annual basis as needed, but that's going to cost money. So the Senate obviously gave us that money in our budget to help support that gap. Moving on to Goal C, Strategy C14, which is the tuition equalization grants. The House appropriates $1 million more for the program that supports financially needy students at the independent colleges and universities of Texas. If we go with the House version, we'll be able to support 150 more students next biennium. Strategy C1.
Ms. Battle,
Yes.
What happened to the Be On Time monies that were allocated to the equalization grant? I mean, was that passed? In other words, the private colleges wanted their portion of Be On Time.
Right.
Right.
That was included in the base bill as we requested it in our LAR. So they did get a bump in the introduced version, and that's what you see here. But the House came in with $1 million more. About $1 million more appropriation.
So it's a lot more than what they've gotten
Yes.
in the past. Okay.
C111 is the open educational resources, and the Senate fully funds our exceptional item request of $250,000 for developing the OER repository and gives us a 1 FTE to help us do that. Also adds an additional $200,000 for the grant program. And you'll recall that this is Senator Kolkhorst's initiative that she passed last session. So I'm sure that's reflective because of her support on the Senate side for this. And she's also on the conference committee. So I feel confident that that will hopefully stay in our budget. The Strategy D17 is the Texas Success Initiative Assessment Enhancement, and the Senate included $300,000 for upgrades to that. We had requested $1 million for that, but they provided $300,000 to support this new online system so that students can retrieve and send their test results more easily than they can today. The Strategy 14 is a Northeast Texas initiative. This is what landed in our budget last session, and it goes to a consortium of colleges and universities that provide a wide range of instruction and healthcare services to 50 rural counties in Northeast Texas. So the House would retain that money, and so in our budget pattern, and we'd support that if that's the route that the conference committee would like to go. It's a good thing to help rural areas. And finally, Baylor College of Medicine. We don't typically comment on this because it's a formula that's dealt with outside of our budget. So I just have NA there for those. So that really is what's going to be considered by the conference committee. And we will put this in front of Senator Taylor and Representative Bonin and hopefully get their support. In addition, you have this, which is the rider differences. You'll see the very first one has to do with the commissioner's salary. So this has been very important for you as you launch the search for the new commissioner. You have indicated that you need to have a more competitive salary in order to attract a more qualified pool of applicants. And so the House version does increase the salary from $212,000 to $242,000 a year. And in the Senate version, it takes it up to $299,000. So we'll certainly advocate on behalf of the Senate version. You'll see some of the other changes in terms of the next three riders, the Professional Nursing Shortage Reduction Program and the Texas Educational Opportunity Program. These were introduced by Representative Howard in the House, and we actually worked with her on this language. They essentially ask us to do a study on these and make recommendations to the legislature, so we're fine with doing that. So we would advocate for the House version. And then finally, the Beyond Time for privates. So whatever's remaining in that account, the Senate recommends that it be transferred to the Tuition Equalization Grant Program. And we're supportive of that. That concludes my presentation.
So on the exceptional items, you said that we had 15
Yes.
and 9?
9 were either fully funded or partially funded at this point in time. So you'll recall the GME, the Graduate Medical Education, when we had requested $60 million, that was automatically included in the introduced version of the bill.
What I wanted to ask you on the 6 that are not showing up, or what's your biggest disappointment?
Probably the critical agency operations of $2.2 million and the $707,000 for compliance monitoring. Those are in Article 11. So like I said, they're not dead yet. So what I was going to ask you is if you would like to direct us to focus on any of these that are in Article 11 and include them in our conversations with the conference committee members to encourage, if there is any money left over, look at this. I think an easy one would be the compliance monitoring funding, because the return on investment is significant. It just, yes.
Yeah, Ms. Battles, I would also like to chime in for the Family Practice Residency Program.
So the reason why we steered away from that is because of the GME, and I think the legislature feels like they have supported GME significantly. It's been hard to get their attention on family practice. But if you want us to try and focus on that over compliance monitoring or agency.
The reason is, we definitely have a shortage of family practice in rural
Right.
areas in Texas. It's a big issue for us. And, it's, I say 2 million, but
Right.
because that's one of the needs that we have in the state.
Right.
So, I would appreciate it if you could look into that.
Okay.
Thank you.
What, you're looking for direction from us?
Yes,
Whether to sort of drop something from the conversation or to sort of keep it
It's-
up, or?
Yes, either if you want us to continue the conversation with some of these Article 11 items, or if you just want us to focus on what's in the conference committee decision document, we can focus on those.
I like what Dr. Farias says, but I think the compliance monitoring, that's easy to understand. And we just have to, I think my thought would be to keep talking about that because of just what you said, just the short argument that it makes sense. How did you put it? The return?
The return on investment, it pays for itself. And obviously, I think that in order to reduce the team's touch points for their their visits to institutions looking at these issues from 10 years to 6 years, by doubling the funding for that and increasing the FTE by 4, I think we'll see significant benefits from that.
Chairman Stedman, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think compliance monitoring, I mean, if there's a return on investment there, but it's also, I think the audit cycle, gets reduced from 10 years to 5 years, which is really, really important. There's a lot of money flowing through the legislature has entrusted that we monitor. The other thing that I would emphasize, and I hear your point about GME and family practice. I mean, that's clearly a need, but the one that I would emphasize are, and I forgot the components, but on the agency operations, the critical IT components, and I'm not sure which one, what's in that 2.2 million, but the things that are really mission critical, and I don't have those off the top of my head, but that's what I would also emphasize.
So are we giving you the kind of input that you want?
Yes, this is very helpful. Thank you.
Anybody else? Ms. Tron, anything? Okay. We ready to move on? Thank you. The first item under finance is a review of the fiscal year 2019 financial report to the board. This item does not require any action. Mr. Ken Martin, Assistant Commissioner for Financial Services, CFO, will present this item to the committee and be available for questions. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. This is the report that we provide every quarter to the board. This is from September 1st through the end of February, so the first 6 months of the fiscal year. If you have any questions, let me know. There are not any notable items that I was going to bring up on those. I would like to touch base a little bit, take this opportunity to discuss a recent bond sale based on a resolution that was approved in July. But if you have any questions on the report, I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, I'll go into the bond sale and some details on that.
And the bond thing is the next item on the agenda.
Actually, this is one we've completed, and and then we'll go on to the agenda of another action item that we're proposing.
All right. So, are there any questions on the I guess this monthly financial report for the period ended 2/28/2019? Is that what we're?
Correct. And then along with this, and it's continue with this agenda item, not to conflate the two with the new resolution we're proposing. In July, the board had approved a resolution for new money bonds to fund student loans for the next academic year, starting in this coming August. And we just closed on those bonds on February 20th. I'm happy to announce we had 9 registered investors. We had 7 that submitted bids. The true interest cost was around 3.35%, a little higher than the previous year. As we know, interest rates had been going up a little bit at the time. We received about $170 million of total proceeds, of which $160 million were bonds, and there was about a $10 million premium. The new rate that we're looking to assign on May 1st for our student loans is 5.2%. We're currently at 5.3, so we're actually lowering the rate, even though the interest rate on these bonds is a little bit higher than previous. And the reason for that is, if you recall, in November, we refinanced previous bonds, or 2007, 2008 series bonds, and that was yielding about $40 million of cash flow over a 13-year period. So think about this. If you refinance a house, you have a 15-year mortgage, you refinance from a 5% to a 4% interest rate, and let's say it saves you $20,000. It's not $20,000 you get right up front. It's really each one of your mortgage payments every month is a little lower than what you would have had to pay. So over the life of the 15 years, you're going to yield $20,000 of savings, but you don't get it up front. It comes over time. Well, the same occurs with this debt, this form of debt. And so the question is, how do we best utilize those savings and pass those savings on to students. And what we're doing basically is being able to lower our interest rate by subsidizing, utilizing about $8 million of those savings by being able to lower the interest rate. And we'll continue to utilize those savings for future bond sales, assuming interest rates will go up, and be able to subsidize that interest rate and keep it very, very low. One point of note, as a comparative purpose, the federal subsidized, this is the lowest interest rate you can get with a federal loan for an undergraduate, the federal subsidized interest rate right now is 5.05%. If a student gets a loan in June, let's say, or even August at 5.2%, upon graduation, if they enter into repayment and they sign up for automatic repayment, just automatic debit out of your checking or savings account, we've instituted a program where you can get a quarter point, 25 basis point reduction. So think about it, you'd be taking your interest rate at that point forward from 5.2% to 4.95%. You would actually have an interest rate lower than the federal subsidized interest rate, being able to do that. So that's what we've been trying to do with the program. It's
Yeah.
not that I'm aware of for a comparable program. There are different programs that you can look at. As you all know, you look at purchasing a car or a house or what have you. You can find a variable rate, and though that rate may be cheaper now, it may be at 4%. What does that mean over the life of a 10 or 20-year student loan? What is that going to average? You don't know, because you've taken on some risk that it could be at 7% sometime down the line. You also have some products out there that have immediate repayment. So the student gets a loan, and the next month you need to start making your payments. Well, not many students can afford to do that. So that'd be parents or somebody that's making those payments for them on their behalf, and that may have a rate that's closer to ours. And then some will have the rate based on, it'll be a fixed rate, but it's based on various different instruments based on the debt that that entity is trying to issue. We issue tax-exempt bonds. We're one of the few states that issue the tax-exempt bonds for this purpose, but other entities will issue other forms of debt, which will be at a higher cost to them, thus higher cost on the student loans, on the interest rate. Some will have an origination fee, 3 to 5% I've typically seen. So an origination fee is basically if you take out a $10,000 loan, you will receive $9,500, but on the books you'll have a $10,000 loan that you need to pay off of. So over time you're paying on $10,000, but you only receive $9,500 of cash. We do not have an origination fee. We eliminated that a couple years ago. Other entities may capitalize the interest, so while you're in school, you're accruing interest. Maybe you took out cumulatively $40,000 of debt. Maybe you accumulate $3,000, $4,000 of interest. What capitalization of interest is, when you graduate and you go into repayment, they take that interest that you've accrued and then they convert it to principal. So instead of $40,000 of debt, you have, say, $43,000, $44,000 of debt. So from that point forward, that interest rate that you have on the loan is now being multiplied by a larger number, $44,000, so you pay higher interest over the term of that loan. We do not capitalize the interest. So if you accrue $3,000 of interest while in college, you still have $3,000 of interest to pay us back, but it does not become principal and become a higher amount. So it's really, you know, it's difficult to get students to completely understand the financial acumen to really truly disseminate between the two, but the short answer to your question is we're not aware of any, and we will have our financial advisor here in just a moment. You're happy, welcome to ask them questions on specifics across national trends.
But yeah, Mr. Martin, Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question real quick? I think I understand that there's different mechanisms in terms of the borrowing the money for the student loans for the students. But I think that I was thinking the same question the commissioner just asked. But I mean, we should be able to get a table to see where other states are at, and I'd like to see that.
Sure.
And just to give us a comparison and to see what some differentiations are. I mean, it's great, if we're the lowest or amongst the lowest. But I would like to see, because I know that ever since, the coordinating board went to the AG's office for help and, defaults and things like that, that there's been a great increase in terms of recouping money. But I think it would be good to see where we stand, even though we know that the curve where people start in different different differentiations in terms of their programs, but it would be good to look at, I think. Thank you.
And I can get that for you. Not
Thank
a problem. The Education Finance Council puts out a survey to their various constituents. We're not a member of that, but we still provide our feedback, and they publish a report, and we'll be able to do that. We'll look for comparable programs to be able to show you. And then just one more comparative note, the federal graduate, so we don't disseminate or discern between.
Mr. Martin, I think, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, no, but go ahead on the bonds. It's not about bonds.
We don't discern between a undergraduate or graduate as far as their interest rate. So the 5.2% is across any one of those. Could be a medical student. The federal government does, and sometimes other entities do as well. So the federal government has a 6.7% rate for a graduate loan, and ours is 5.3 today, 5.2%. So we do see a portion of our loans going to graduate students as well, which is a great benefit. That's a substantial differentiation between the two.
So I know I see this all the time, but I maybe just now focused on it. What is the available budget? I mean, I just can't, I don't understand. There seems to be, there's expenses that you've incurred, then there's this encumbrance, and then the difference is available budget, but.
Sure, let me walk you through, and let me, for the other members, get you to a specific page. If you can turn to, in the upper right-hand corner, page 2, and at the very top, it'll say operating and trustee budget. If you look at the first column with numbers, it'll say original budget. That is the budget, as you recall, every year, either April or July, it'll be July for this year, we come to the board for the agency's operating budget. So next year's budget, you all will approve in July. That is our baseline. Let me call that the baseline budget, or original budget as we have in the column. So that's what I'll call the board-approved or baseline budget. Over time, we may have some adjustments. If it's a collected, donated program, maybe we receive more money, federal programs, so we'll have budget adjustments, which are disclosed in this report as well, so that the board sees what changes we have made subsequent to the original budget approval. And then the adjusted budget is a combination of those two. Fiscal year-to-date expenses, I think those are fairly straightforward. An encumbrance is, I'll give you an example. If we have a contract that we contract with an entity for grants, and it could be GME, for example, and we contract with them for $250,000. We may, depending on the terms of the contract, expend those funds over time. So as soon as we contract and obligate $250,000 to that entity, we'll set up an encumbrance. So think of the encumbrance as an obligation.
Okay, so I understand that, but the odd thing in this section A, I mean, most of that stuff is salaries, right?
Quite a bit.
So how do you encumber yourself on salaries? In other words, I could see the encumbrance on Texas grants or what, you know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we'll take, our payroll department does this, and they fall under finance, and at the beginning of the year and throughout the year, but at the beginning of the year, we'll take all employees who are here at that point in time, and we know what their salary is, so we'll take the annual salary and we'll encumber that within the departments. And this is a tool that is intended for the divisions to help manage their budget. So we'll encumber that.
So that's what they have left over, that's left to spend on salaries until the end of the fiscal year.
Salaries, or if they had some supplies that they've obligated for, some professional services, college readiness and success will have the Apply Texas, and so they do have some funding that are non-salaried that they'll spend with UT Austin on their contract.
Okay, but then what's the available budget? It's just this.
That is the difference. So if you take the adjusted budget and then subtract out expenses and subtract out encumbrances, that's your available budget. So after
what does that mean? In other words, can't we use that for like compliance, staffing?
It is available for the use within the strategy, depending, and then the answer, can that be moved? When I say available, it's available at the time. So Dr. Rex Peeble, Julie Eklund, Dr. Booker, any one of them could be looking at these numbers throughout the year and see how much they have available to spend. They may have unanticipated expenses that would have reduced the available budget first on what they initially expected, and this is just a tool for them to manage. So as the year progresses, hopefully you see the available budget go down. They're utilizing their funds. If you see that the available budget in July is that same number in college readiness and success, then we need to be looking at other opportunities of how can we deploy those funds elsewhere, what are we allowed to deploy those funds for to be utilized elsewhere. Maybe Dr. Eklund has a data purchase for some national data that we could do, and we could see, could we deploy that money somewhere else?
You can move from A.1.1 to A.1.6? I'm just making it, I mean,
Yes,
random,
apparently. I
I
see
mean,
what
can
you're
you,
thinking.
you can kind of move it around, but then can you move from A to B?
Cannot move from A to B. That in the General Appropriations Act is restricted. We typically can move from any one of the A's. Now, oversight for profit, fields of study are fairly new. If there's a rider, a lot of these do not have a rider with them, so going from academic quality and workforce A14 to A15 would be allowable for general revenue. I'm not talking donated funds or some of the others. But let's say fields of study has a rider in there, and it says all funds are appropriated in the A18 strategy for purposes of fields of study. That would lock those funds in for that purpose only. We would not have the ability to transfer them. If we had leftover funding, and sometimes we do, we would need to submit a letter to the LBB and request permission to do so and receive permission. Otherwise, we would not be able to make those transfers. So we have to look at what the General Appropriations Act detail has, if any, along those lines. In the B, we are free to move between B11 and B13. As we set up our budget, we do so based on priorities. And but we could not move from A11 to B11.
Okay.
That is restricted in the General Appropriations
So
Act.
what does this pie chart tell you? In other words, like, do you guys look at this and say, oh man, we've got 4.2 million just sitting around?
Well, what it tells us, at the beginning of the year, you expect that gap to be larger, the availability to be larger. You haven't had all your contracts, your commitments. As you're looking at your programs, your grant programs are still working on contracting. You want to see that pie chart shrink. You want to see the blue get larger and the available funds to shrink throughout the year. That is the typical scenario. We don't start the year with all funds committed. Many contracts require board approval. So maybe they have to come within January or the April or what have you. So it may take time. I know GME does a lot of their spending in the summer time frame, so they have to work with the entities that they negotiate with and based on RFP and whatever their process is, and then be able to make the commitments during the year. But then by summer, they're actually expending. So we'll see encumbrances increase through the year, and then by summer, we'll see the encumbrances go down, your obligation, and your expenditures go up.
So,
Okay.
Utilize your
question,
funds.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Martin, so I think it seems to me, just by looking at the original budget, I mean, we have a lot left over. So I know that when the commissioner gets with each area and asks for input on the budget, and it comes to us in July, right, coming
Correct.
up. So, I mean, it seems like we need to probably look at that original budget a little closer. Would you agree with that?
The budget, so the budget process, let me review that. I would agree with that. And the budget process, some of this is timing. Keep in mind, this is the first 6 months of the year. So now I'm not concerned because this is typical of the timing of the year, of the fiscal year.
Right.
A lot of this is because of the timing of commitment of funding. If you had a professional service that you budgeted for example, maybe you did not anticipate utilizing them until May, and you may not have committed and executed a contract with them until April. It wouldn't show up in this report, but that available funding, as an assistant commissioner, you might already have in your mind that you're utilizing some of that. It just won't show up here because they have not executed an obligation yet. Yeah. In the budgeting process, which we're starting to go through here in May, Finance will send out to the divisions a detailed spreadsheet, list all your employees, list your anticipated salaries, longevity pay, et cetera. We'll have supplies, all this detail that they line item out. We'll have a target based on their current year funding. And that is a starting point. So call that, let's call it a starting point. And they will go from there. We'll see how all that lines up with whatever we get at the end of May in our conference committee version of the Appropriations Act. From there, we'll also have a separate meeting of what additional items, what other items does a division want to perform? Maybe they want to hire people for compliance. Maybe they want to hire somebody to provide more oversight for profits, et cetera. And those will be, I'll call, in lack of a better word, the exceptional items. Those will be reviewed and prioritized. So Ms. Battles, Mr. Franz, Dr. Gardner, all those will be presented to them, and they'll look at it, and then they have the ability to determine, well, yes, that is a worthwhile area to do something more in the for-profit oversight, but we need to find the funding for it. It's not currently in that strategy. I'm just giving you an example. And we're going to pull from one of the others. And so then they'd make the decision that, well, based on this is a lower priority, one of these functions, we need to remove, reduce, eliminate this function and move it down here. And that does occur during the budgeting cycle as well. And we also look at who typically has available money, funding left over. The typical, you look at the numbers now, and they may look large, especially if you look in the loan program. But if you, and keep in mind the loan program, those are all loan funds, so those will not lapse from a general revenue. That's just loan money that'll go back into the loan fund, can be reissued as student loans or what have you. But a lot of the others are GR. Typically, you'll see towards the end of the year, we're around $50,000, could be 20, that each one of these entities has available budget. It goes down that far. And if you ask any one of my counterparts, they'll know that I ask a lot of questions at year end. I have a lot of emails. I'm walking to their door. What are you doing? I'm walking between them. Hey, can you do this? If he has 50 here, can you take it? We're doing that right now with work study. We have available funding in work study. So we're working with Dr. Booker on college readiness and success to try and see if he can utilize some of that in mentorship. So we want to utilize the funding as much as possible. We don't want to waste it, but we are chartered to utilize that, and it's an expectation of legislatures.
Well, yeah, the work study is the one that stood out. That's
right.
Why I brought the question up.
And we're in the process there. So I can give you the specific timely, because it was about 2 days ago we devised our plan. Approximately $500,000 of that funding will go to mentorship, which is part of the C17 strategy. We have college work study, which is our students working on campus or off campus that each institution receives, and then mentorship, which is separate, and that portion of the program's run by College Readiness and Success. That program on mentoring students, trying to get them into college, et cetera, and we're paying students to do that. So we're looking at about a $500,000 transfer to that mentorship, which will stay within the C17, but we want to transfer the remaining money probably to our other grant programs, such as Texas Grant and TEOG Community College. And that we do have the ability to do within the GAA. We have a 20% total appropriation, so out of that initial $9.4 million, we can transfer up to 20%, and the rider does not prohibit us. Sometimes you can have a rider language that does. It does not, so then we're looking to transfer the remaining money to Texas Grant and TEOG Community
Good.
College.
You're on top of the transfers and watching that carefully. Good.
Yes, sir. And we are in the process of drafting a letter for the ones that we cannot. So there was a question Mr. Stedman asked on Beyond Time Private. Yes, they did in the submitted version and engrossed for the House bill and Senate bill include our recommendation for TEG, or excuse me, excess funds from beyond time that aren't going to be utilized because last year was here and we're going down here. There's less students in the program. That be assigned to TEG, and they did take those up in both areas and one a little higher. In this year, we will still have remaining funding. If you look at private, approximately $1.7 million. That will require an LBB approval to move because in rider it says these funds will only be utilized for renewal students for beyond time loans, so it locks us into the purpose. But we are intending to submit a letter to the LBB to request that transfer to TEG to continue the process. Since that was in, which is nice, it was in the House bill and the Senate bill, it shows that that is the legislature's desire, then we feel comfortable being able to submit a request to the LBB to ask legislature to allow us to do it this year since they're already doing it in the subsequent years.
Okay, any other questions or comments on this? All right, the next item under finance is consideration of adopting a resolution authorizing the issuance of State of Texas college student loan bonds in one or more series to refund the 2009 bond series and the delegation of the authority for administration and approval of the activities necessary to complete the sale of the private activity bonds. So Mr. Martin will present this item to the committee and be available for questions. A representative from the board's bond counsel, McCall, Parkhurst, and Horton, and financial advisors from Hilltop Securities and Yukari Consultants, LLC, will also be available to answer questions regarding the proposed resolution authorizing the issuance of the bonds, the delegation of authority to approve all final terms of the bonds, and the delegation of authority to file for the state's allocation of private activity volume cap. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. So this is you know, the fun part of the job is how do we take our debt that we have. We issue new debt and we issue new loans, but we also would be amiss if we did not manage the existing debt we have today. Again, I like to equate this to somebody, and the easiest part is you're owning a house and a mortgage. You know, you'd be amiss if interest rates went down and you didn't look at the opportunity of potentially refinancing your house. There's a cost to refinance that house, but does it more than offset your future gain? And we continually look at our working capital, and we've done so. As you recall, I just mentioned that we refunded the 2007 and 2008 series bonds, yielded around $40 million of cash flow. I think around $17 million at net present value. Our 2009 series bonds are coming due to be callable, so we have a call period of every 10 years, which means for the first 10 years we cannot refund those bonds. They're locked. After that, any remaining bonds could be refinanced if the interest rate is favorable, and that's what we'll discuss in more detail. But let me introduce my esteemed colleagues here, Mr. Richard Donahue, who is our bond counsel from McCall, Parkhurst, and Horton, Mr. Lee Donner from Hilltop Securities, and Ms. Yava Scott. And I will let Mr. Donner talk about a update that just recently occurred.
Yeah, thank you. Before we get into the matters at hand, I want to make an announcement to the board. Effective this morning, Yava Scott and Carmen Tyler Best, the two principals of Yukari Consultants, became managing directors in the municipal advisory group at Hilltop Securities. We're very, very excited about that development. The two firms began to develop a deeper relationship as a function of working together on this particular engagement for the coordinating board. As we've done transactions for you, we've found other areas of commonality of interest and intersection of interest, of interest, and it's evolved to the point where we began to talk about joining forces, and as I said, we're very excited that Yava and Carmen are part of Hilltop Securities, effective at opening of business this morning. Looking to a long-term relationship.
So that thing in front of you is wrong now? Is that it should say Hilltop Securities?
Completely wrong as of this morning. Yeah.
I was not allowed to disclose this.
Well, we reported to this information to Ken at the earliest possible date once we knew it was going to happen, which was on Monday, and the engagements became official this morning. So we wanted to get the word to you as soon as possible.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So let me get into the details of what we're requesting. This is a bond resolution, so similar to what you approved in July for new money and in October for refunding. This is very similar. This is a refunding. It is not new money. We're basically looking to refinance, take our 2009 series bonds. After August 1st, our last payment will be August 1st. It will make for principal. We'll have $55 million of remaining par value bonds, and we're looking to refinance those bonds. The refinancing, or refunding as we call it in the bond world, is we'll basically issue new bonds, take those proceeds, and pay off the old bonds. In doing so, the projection is around, currently today, approximately $12 million of cash flow savings over a 14-year period, which is very favorable. It yields around a little over $9 million in net present value, which again is also very favorable against $55 million. So the interest rate market is still favorable. It started going up a little bit, and it has gone down a little bit lately. We want to take advantage of that. We think with your approval, if the board approves, that we'd be able to close probably in about 2 months. We will submit a notice of intent to the bond review board today, and if the resolution is approved, we'll submit the final resolution to complete that application after the board meeting tomorrow. And I'll let Mr. Donahue talk about the nuances of the resolution. He typically goes through what you're authorizing by approving the resolution.
Sounds good. For the record, I'm Richard Donahue with McCall, Parkhurst, and Horton. We serve as bond counsel to the coordinating board. The resolution you have in front of you operates nearly identically to the refunding bond resolution that the board approved in October previously. This issue authorizes up to $55 million in principal amount of refunding bonds to refund the Series 2009 bonds. Those are the only bonds that are eligible to be refunded now. That $55 million maximum par amount is the amount of outstanding 2009 bonds. So we have a par-to-par limitation that we're living within. The resolution delegates the authority to finally price the bonds to either the commissioner or the chief financial officer. And so this will be the board's official action, and there will be no further board action to authorize the bonds. There is, like the previous deal, there is a requirement that the bonds be sold for net present value debt service savings, so you will achieve a savings in order to finish this transaction. The delegation of authority is legally good for 1 year, but as Mr. Martin indicated, we plan to move as quickly as possible to get you to market to get those savings locked in as soon as we can. And so should the board approve it tomorrow, as he indicated, the next step is to go to the bond review board to get their approval. Then we'll plan to post the preliminary official statement and price the bonds in price and close in the month of June is the current schedule.
Question, Mr. Chairman. Go ahead. Of course, the AG's office have to have final approval of this.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
so do you see any concerns with that?
I do not. This transaction is substantially similar to the transaction we did a year ago. The only difference is the bonds involved. So.
And one nuance on this one, in the prior transaction, we utilized so we have to request from the bond review board a portion of the state ceiling, what we call volume cap, or the tax exempt allotment from the federal government, and that's approximately $3 billion. So we have to request a reservation for a portion of those to say we're going to issue tax exempt bonds. We need a portion. That's just a reservation saying that you have this much of the state's ability to issue tax-exempt bonds, and we have to go through all the other things, legal requirements to make sure they are indeed meeting the requirement for the IRS tax exemption. In the previous refunding, one nuance that's different here is in the previous refunding, we utilized the existing, and apologize, try and get this, and have Mr. Donahue help me in case I fumble. We utilize the existing tax-exempt authority. We did not request new tax-exempt authority. We issued tax-exempt bonds. We're refunding those bonds, so we can do so under the previous authority that we had back in 2007, 2008, with one nuance. The IRS only allows you to issue if you're refunding, then those refunded bonds can only go up to 17 years from the date of the original issue of those first bonds or the average life of the bond. So one of the savings that I mentioned in the previous meeting on those refunding bonds was the fact that we shortened the term. Instead of the bonds that were in existence were going to exist, and we'd continue to make payments for approximately 13 years, we shrunk that down to about 8 years. So as you know, you go from a mortgage of 30 years down to 15 years, you can typically just lower your interest rate over a shorter term. Well, we did that there. With these bonds, we're not planning to do so. What we are planning, we will make a request to the Bond Review Board under subceiling 6 of Texas Government Code 1372 to request $55 million of tax, up to $55 million of tax-exempt allocation so that we can keep the existing term. I do not want to shrink the term because, as you know, you go from a 30-year mortgage to 15, your monthly payment goes up. So for us, that's not financially viable into perpetuity. All we want to do is issue new bonds to refund the old bonds. We'll issue new bonds, essentially similar terms, length, that the current bonds are at. That's just one nuance. It's different than the previous ones. We will be requesting part of that subceiling. And
So there seems to be two caps to your bond issue. I mean, one is the IRS issue to get tax exempt status, but then also there's this state cap, the amount that the legislature will allow you to take of their tax exempt, AAA credit, backing. So on the state issue, does that go back to 2007, or do they look at it like these are a new set of bonds, but then since you're retiring the old ones, then you get credit, so it's kind of a wash?
We are going to be relying on the constitutional provision that the original 2009 bonds were issued under for that state limit. So we're not using any new authority. As long as we stay under the $55 million of principal amount the bonds that we're refunding, we can issue $55 million in principal amount of new bonds to take those out without using any new state authority.
Gotcha. Thanks.
And the one benefit, besides a lower rate and saving money, one of the benefits is in doing so, when we refund, as we did with the prior, we typically receive a premium. So let me give the scenario. $55 million of par value bonds, not including interest, will refund. So that's debt. That goes against our constitutional limit. If we were to do it today, based on the estimate, investors typically want a little higher interest rate than the market rate stated on the bonds. They're willing to pay you cash more than the bond amount for that. So typically we'll receive, the latest analysis from Hilltop was around $48 million of par, and we would receive approximately $7 million of premium. That means we would take the fees, $55 million of debt, that would go away, and we'd only bring on $48 million of debt. So it gives us about a $7 million cushion to our state ceiling. So it helps us go down a little bit from where we are versus that state ceiling. And we saw the same thing occur with our prior bonds. Went from $110 million down to around, I believe, $95, $98 million. So about $20 million between both deals to lower our total overall outstanding debt.
Okay, I thought I understood it, but I thought you said it doesn't affect the state ceiling for now. It goes back to the state ceiling when the bonds were issued. And yet, I thought Ken just said, well, no, now we've actually increased our capacity, the current capacity.
Well, I think Ken is talking about your ability to pay debt service, what your debt service profile looks like, and how much principal amount will be outstanding. But that original authority from 2009 is essentially used up. You can't issue any more new money bonds, but we can refund the existing bonds as long as we stay within the amount of outstanding principal amount. So as long as we stay within less than $55 million par amount, we can issue new bonds. Now, well, effectively, he's talking about a market pricing mechanism. The way when you go to the market, you price bonds, you're going to get more proceeds than you are the par amount just by the way bonds are trading in the market.
But it doesn't affect our cap currently,
That's
either
correct.
way. It
That's
doesn't
correct.
reduce it, it doesn't increase the
That's correct.
It
allocation.
will simply reduce your debt outstanding.
Yeah, okay, right, but, gotcha.
Right. To make it clear, it doesn't change the cap. We still have a $1.86 billion cap plus $275 million from Constitutional Amendment 50B-6. So those combined, that's our cap, that's our ceiling. We cannot exceed that in totality. All it does is our total debt is here. By doing this, we lower total debt a little bit here. Doesn't change the top, just gives us a little more cushion in the future for future debt.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
Just in summary, again, I know you mentioned this earlier, so the committee will make a recommendation or not recommend it to the full board tomorrow, and hopefully it's a recommendation tomorrow. So go over the timetable again, assuming tomorrow's approval.
Sure. If the board approves tomorrow, and you are correct, sir, that the committee would if the committee approves, make the recommendation, this would go to the board. We'll have the similar discussion tomorrow. And if the board approves, we will have our application with the bond review board. They will approve a portion of the state ceiling. They have to approve, typically we're an exempt issuer where we don't actually go to the board, but we do submit all the documentation, everything we have to. They look at it. It's typically rote, so it's a little bit different versus maybe a housing project that could be different every year. Sometimes they do call me into their pre-meeting that they have a week before the board meeting, and I'll answer any questions. From there, we have the rating agencies. We have the ratings already for this, AAA rated, and we are GO, so we're backed by the general obligation, backed by the state. We will then begin the continuation of the official statement that we publish and the development of that. We will, once upon board approval, we'll be able to then go to market, which is best case. Right now, it's an aggressive timeline, get us out into June. I believe around mid-June to get us to market, get to pricing. Again, we want to try and lock in as quick as possible. It could be into July. We have up to 90 days before the call date. So the earliest we could do it would be 90 days prior to the call date being 8/1, that the IRS allows for that not to be considered an advance refunding. You used to be able to perform advance refundings longer than that, but the IRS, through the latest tax act that came through about a year and a half ago, that was eliminated. But 90 days is not considered an advance refunding. So if we refund sometime in June, we're within that 90-day window, we're fine. We can refinance after 8/1 if we wanted to. But again, we're targeting mid-June. That does, once we price, before we can actually close on the deal, the AG's office, we have to submit all documentation to them. They have to provide final approval. Once we get final approval, then we close on these, and we wire the money to Wells Fargo. Will be our escrow agent. We'll wire the money to Wells Fargo and all necessary items, and then the old bonds of 2009 will be considered legally defeased, and we will then take on the new bonds.
Just one other quick scheduling note, just I think Ken's covered it perfectly, that in addition, because we have this volume cap that we're going to get from the Bond Review Board, we are required to have a quick public hearing that staff will conduct prior to the Bond Review Board's approval of the bonds in May.
Ms. Scott, welcome. You have anything to add?
I would ask if Mr. Donner or Ms. Scott, the question regarding interest rates, I will still work to provide those based on the information that we have, but if you have any information on the current market or other conditions, appreciate it.
Yeah, the numbers you've heard, the net present value savings projected it's right at 9.7 million net present value savings projected, 12 million gross cash flow savings. That's based on an analysis that we ran Monday based on interest rates as of Monday morning. And just to give you some sense what's driving that. The weighted average coupon on the remaining 2009 bonds still outstanding, the ones you're talking about refunding, is 4.535%. The all-in true interest cost on the refunding we're talking about, based on Monday's rates, would be 2.455%. And it's that dramatic differential that is producing that high as net present value savings on a comparatively small refunding issue. That comes out to 17.63% net present value savings. As some of you are probably aware, in the municipal world, 3% net present value savings is considered more than ample basis for proceeding with a refunding, and you're at over 5 times that. Market conditions are outstanding. You offer your bonds, and you've done this historically for many, many years, except in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, but you do competitive bid offering. You're the only student loan issuer in the country that does competitive bid student loan bonds, and it's because the state of Texas GO obligation backs these bonds, and that makes them a perfect candidate for a competitive offering. You heard Mr. Martin give you how many bidders and the results from the new money issue in February. We expect similar results here. Right now we have a undersupply of municipal bonds and an oversupply of money. We've had positive inflows into the bond funds for 16 consecutive weeks. So there are a lot of dollars chasing a very limited forward supply. You're coming at a good time. Scheduled pricing right now projected a week of June 10th. Everything looks good. Nothing should interfere with that. And we would expect the results to be very similar to what you achieved in February.
Thank you. Yes, sir. So the motion's been made by Dr. Freya. Second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Stedman. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. The last item under Finance is consideration of authorization to enter into an agreement with the Office of the Attorney General to provide collection services for the agency student loan program. Mr. Ken Martin and Mr. Ron Del Vento, Assistant Attorney General, Bankruptcy and Collections Division, will present this item to the committee and be available for questions. Ms. Rachel Obaldo, Deputy Chief, Bankruptcy and Collections Division, is also present and available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. As you know, we have an agreement with the Office of Attorney General we've had since, I believe, 2010 to perform collection on defaulted loans. It's been a very successful agreement with them. Give you a point of reference, we used to be less than $4 million annually excuse me, on a collection basis, and this last year was over $12 million. We've grown almost $1 million a year. It continues to, the growth continues to exceed what we pay in the contract for the Office of Attorney General. We transferred a team of individuals from the coordinating board to the AG's office to perform this function, as well as leverage existing resources, expertise at the AG's office to perform these functions. Within this contract that we're requesting approval, it'll be for another 2-year agreement. Within the contract, we pay for the ancillary fees related to the collection. So serving notices to individuals, court costs, filing fees, et cetera, that we pay. The actual fee to the Attorney General would be capped at $650,000 each year, so approximately $1.3 million. But we would also pay, by utilizing various vendors, these other types of fees. So that's why you see here around a little over $2.6 million that we're requesting in total, because I did want to disclose those other items that we do pay as part of this agreement. we would be paying them whether we did it ourselves or if the AG's office did it, but we run it through the AG, so I did want to disclose that as well. I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, I'll pass it on to Mr. Del Vento and Ms. Albaldo to discuss the details.
Good afternoon. As Ken was saying, this has been a very successful partnership since the AG's office took over management of the defaulted student loan practice in November of 2009, and we've had an interagency agreement since that period. Collections have increased each year since 2009, as Ken said, to the point where it was just south of $4 million. We're now at the point where we're collecting about $1 million a month. 100% of the costs that are incurred, costs would include filing fees, lawsuit fees, service fees, as well as the recovery of attorney's fees exceed the amount that the board is spending under this contract. One way to look at it is if you're looking at a $1.3 million biennial contract, $639,000 or so per fiscal year, the recovery of that occurs within 6 weeks of the program. So it's been very successful. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Cheryl Bellison, our student loan manager who came over in 2009. It's really a large part to her management that we've been able to show this success over the years. Since inception of the program, we've recovered $86,116,000, of which $3,380,000 were recovery of court costs and an additional $11,281 in attorney's fees, which are allocated back to the board. In fact, there's actually a net profit if you were to consider the costs that are incurred compared to the recoveries that are made in just those two categories. And I mentioned to Ken in an email the other day, I think what we're most proud of is the fact that the average number of days a case is open on our inventory was 594 days in fiscal year 10. That's dropped to 165 days in FY19. Do you have any specific questions?
Yeah, I wish I had an investment like that. 6 weeks payout, that's pretty good. Okay, so Ken, I'm looking at this loan receivables review in your packet, and not on this agenda, but the financial report, and it says loans forgiven. So why do we forgive loans?
We like to give money away.
Yeah, and it's kind of a brother-in-law kind of deal.
Right. You weren't supposed to notice that line item. The loans that you'll see in this financial report, or in that one section, those are all loans combined. CAL, bond money we just discussed, Beyond Time, forgivable loans, Texas Armed Services Scholarship loans, forgivable loans, as well as some older loans like our FELP loans, our federal loans, HEAL, HELP, getting very, very small. We have a couple $1 million in each one of those, but that is a culmination of all of those loans. That's not just the CAL. So in the CAL loan program, no, we do not have a forgiveness provision. We have to pay our debt. We have debt coming in. We have to get it going out. The BOT was funded through general revenue or general revenue dedicated. We had tuition set-asides, or we had straight general revenue that the state appropriated, so they could forgive those loans.
Oh, so Beyond Time is a forgiveness program the way it's set up.
That is correct.
Yeah, okay.
And it's waning. You'll see that forgiveness number go down, but that is the forgiveness you're seeing. There's a very, very small component. We're starting to see forgiveness in our Texas Armed Services Scholarship Program, which is essentially a loan forgiveness if the members complete ROTC and they complete their commitment as an officer in one of the armed services, they can be forgiven. That'll be in there as well. But again, those programs are funded by general revenue. So the numbers you're seeing are combined, but the forgiveness are just for those two programs individually.
Doesn't apply to CAL loans.
It does not.
Good.
I'm happy to answer any other questions.
You mentioned a cap on the legal fees. Is that right?
On the, to the Attorney General for it, the serve, file, express serve that we use as a vendor are court costs. No, those are, we pay as we go as those are filed. But the actual agreement between us for the cost of the collection team will be capped at $650,000. That is the same number that's in place for fiscal year 18 and 19. It's
But why is it capped? Why is it?
we like it that way.
Yeah, well, I know, but I mean,
It's advantageous to us. When the agreement started, we had an initial agreement, and this is before my time in the role, so correct me if I'm misstating, is we had a cost share arrangement with, so attorney fees, if a borrower ends in default, and let me correct myself on 650,000, it's actually
669.5.
yeah. It's almost 670,000. We increased that for merit and whatnot. So apologies. It's relatively flat except for about a 3% bump. So
it was 650.
that is correct. It's 650 in this year, and
3%,
we agreed
3%
for
will
a
take it to
slight increase to cover merit.
669,500
Yes, sir.
per year. Okay.
Per year. And that's per year, so it does cap at the year. Typically, by the end of the third quarter, maybe beginning of fourth quarter, we've achieved that cap. So by fourth quarter, we have a very nominal invoice from the Attorney General for that particular function. In the past, we had a cost share, so based on collections received, the attorney fee that was coming in, there was a proportional share, and the agreement was to eliminate that a while back. I forget the exact year, but then go to a straight fee per, and that's how we've negotiated today.
In essence, they're billing. You're billing for your time, and then at some point it gets capped. Is that?
That is correct. They send us a detailed billing statement, attorney time, various individuals there, as well as the collections team, which is mostly billed at 100%. Others will be billed based on what courts they needed to attend, et cetera. And then the rate, and it's just a straight billing from there, and we'll get a quarterly invoice against it. And again, once we hit that 650 or 669,500 cap, then we don't pay any more for just that function.
To be clear, if I may add, the IAC is limited solely to the collection of defaulted student loans. So if there is other work that other divisions of the Attorney General's office are performing at the request of the coordinating board, that work does not come within the scope of the interagency contract.
Good. I think that's it. I'll entertain a motion.
I'll make the motion.
So it's made by Mr. Stedman.
Second.
Seconded by Dr. Farias. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. The first item under internal audit is discussion of statements on auditing standards number 114, the auditor's communication with those charged with governance. This item does not require any action. Ms. Susan Warren, audit partner with KPMG LLP, will present this item to the committee and be available for questions. Ms. Warren.
Is that better? Yeah.
Your mic on?
Is that better? Okay, sorry. That was red. I thought it was supposed to be green. So here. You can see that where the agenda here is to represent the team, go through our risk assessment process, go through our audit strategy, and then the required communications. As the auditor, we are required to inform the committee and the board. To start with, the team, we've introduced myself, Susan is the audit partner, Shannon is the audit manager. You have Chris Stone, who's our IT director, Travis, who's what we call our quality partner. In KPMG, every engagement has 2 partners that look at the actual report and deliverables and the risk assessment decisions to make sure from a quality perspective we've made the right choice. And then we do have an actuary on the team who looks at the pension and OPEB or other post-employment benefit accruals that are in your financial statements. From a risk assessment perspective, we have several. What this chart is trying to show you is what the risks really are in the financial statements. There's always a risk of management override of controls just by the nature of that. Management can and sometimes does do things they're not supposed to. It's always a risk in a financial statement environment. So what those words tell you there is that it's something we do consider. It obviously is on a spectrum, so you can have a lower risk and a higher risk. But if there was a risk there, it would be a risk of error. It would be a risk of fraud, per se, if they were going to do something inappropriate. And so that's why the check mark is in the fraud box. We do procedures. We have inquiries. We look at journal entries. We look at things where management could potentially do that, just to make sure we don't see anything of that nature. There are some estimates in your financial statements, primarily related to the allowance for the student loans that you just were talking about from that perspective. And so that is a complex and degree of subjectivity because it is based on assumptions. And so we look at those assumptions, we look at historical data, we look at a lot of IT reports out of the Helm system to make sure that information is correct. And of course, all of that comes down to a potential risk of error if those assumptions were not applied correctly. Moving into the IT systems, as you are well aware, you have a lot of IT systems here that run your programs. And so we do have an IT team, as I mentioned, Chris, who's here to look at those. We do a lot of general control testing on change management, who has access and who doesn't, segregation of duties. And we also looked at what we call the edit checks or interfaces. Is the system doing what you thought it should do? Is it making sure you have a promissory note before you disperse the money? Is it making sure you have a co-signer if that's required? That type of stuff. So we're looking at those things in your system before the loans are issued to basically validate the reliability of the information and the reports that are then used for the allowance from that perspective. We do have some significant audit areas. Valuation of the student loans, as we already mentioned, from the allowance perspective. We do have the debt and the debt covenants that was just discussed that we take a look at. You have all of your incoming financial assistance that's appropriated and the expenditures going out to the universities. And then, of course, the revenue that goes with that. So those are what you would expect to see, your significant numbers, if you will, in your financial statements. So those are obviously significant audit areas that we take a look at from that perspective. You can see here that the check marks are really in the error column. Just because of the volume of transactions and things, it is possible that human error could record something incorrectly. And so that's what we're looking for when we're looking at those audit numbers. We do, as I mentioned, have an actuarial specialist on the team. He's looking at the actuarial valuations that are really done by ERS on your behalf. But we do take a look at those valuation reports that are done by GRS and Red and Wisdom to make sure that the allocation to the coordinating board appears reasonable. Questions on the risk?
So, excuse me.
Yes.
Is this about the loans? I mean, because what else would you want to?
No, this is about the employees of the coordinating board share in the liability that the state has for pensions when they retire, and also for OPEB, or post-employment benefit, medical, primarily medical and dental. And so a portion of that is allocated to the coordinating board and thus reflected in your financial statements.
And why would we have to do that actuarial analysis if it's a state program?
You don't. ERS does it on your behalf. But we, as the auditors, take a look at it to make sure the part that they allocated down to you is reasonable based on your head count.
Okay.
Other questions? The next one is just a pictorial of the timeline. You can see January to April is what we're really in now and trying to do all of our planning. We actually are on site starting to do our control walkthroughs and finishing up our IT work, which goes through the end of the month. We do finish up our procedures in April and May, and then we issue the reports in June and come back and report to you in July. Very similar to the prior years. This section here is the required things that the standards require us just to remind you of. So materiality, just a little context here. Materiality is what an auditor uses to decide if they find something that's not correct, if it's important enough to make an adjustment or not. That's really what materiality is. And so KPMG, as all firms do, the standards require you have some type of mathematical computation to come up with that. Most people call it a magic number, but we come up with this number that's do not pass go, right? If you have an error that's greater than this number, whoops, stop, got to talk to management and figure out what to do about it. So that's really what materiality is. It gives us kind of that flavor of what we can pass on in the work papers. For instance, if we're doing a reconciliation and there's a $100 rounding error, we don't care about $100. You wouldn't want us to chase down $100. It's a rounding error. So materiality allows us to make a note and move on. Materiality drives how much work we have to do and how much work we don't from that perspective. So that's what materiality is all about. Responsibilities. So management prepares the financial statements and gives those to us to audit. The middle part there basically says they give us all the records we need to do our audit and access to the appropriate people to discuss and ask questions. And of course, the bottom box says that you help with that process by setting the proper tone at the top for allowing us to have access to the coordinating board's records. The next one tells you what KPMG has been hired to do. We have been hired to put an opinion on those financial statements when we finish our audit. And the middle box there kind of gives you all our responsibilities, all the standards we have to follow. And then the bottom box actually talks about that there's parts of your financial statements. Most people think of a balance sheet and income statement, but there's also an MD&A section that leads in that kind of gives you a background, and can be some supplemental schedules at the back that give you budget to actuals and things like that. We do look at all that together and make sure it ticks and ties is basically what the bottom part of this is telling you. We do have some responsibilities to look at the entire package, not just the statements themselves. Slide 11 is all the things that might possibly go wrong in an audit. Is really what this slide is about. And if that happens, we're required to tell you. So I'll just name off a few of them off this list. But if we were to find a failure in controls, like a significant deficiency or a material weakness, we are required to tell you that. If we were to find a violation of law or fraud or illegal act, we are required to tell you that. So this is really kind of the list of things that if we discover an audit, we would come back to you in July and report. Any questions on the responsibilities?
Course of doing an audit, if you found some problems with internal controls, if you came across them, then you're obligated to come back and tell us.
Absolutely.
But you're not actually looking at internal controls.
We do look.
And when you issue your statement, you're going to actually specifically say you're not including internal controls.
We don't give an opinion on internal controls like you would in a SOC 404 or PCOB audit. We do not. But we do look at controls over financial reporting. For example, the loan system is a great opportunity for that. So we are looking at the controls in the loan system of how it processes a loan and how it interfaces with your general ledger system to actually record the balances that are in the financial statements. So from a financial process, we are looking at controls. We look at the controls over reconciling the bank accounts. Is somebody looking at that? Is it being done timely? We're looking at controls over segregation of duties. Did somebody override a expense request and basically initiate it and approve it? So we do look at financial reporting controls, but we do not give an opinion at a SOC level. You are correct. All right, so slide 12 is the kind of the question slide where we get to ask you some questions and get input into our process since we're just starting our audit to see if there's anything that you would like to let us be aware of that we need to consider in our planning process. So the first question is the committee aware of any matters that you believe would be possible violations of laws or regulations that we would need to have a further discussion with either Bill or whoever else was involved?
So you're asking us questions,
I am.
and we're supposed to say yes or no?
You are.
Okay.
Please.
All right. Are we aware of matters relevant to the audit, including but not limited to violations or possible violations of laws and regulations? I am not.
Thank you.
No.
Okay. 2, do you have any concerns about fraud of a coordinating board employee that we would need to look into further, or allegations of?
No, I don't.
Actually, isn't this the first time we've done it this way? Do you recall doing this before? Why is that? Why are we doing it
I
differently?
don't know. We've always had these questions. Maybe we did it more generically in the past.
Or maybe called us on the phone or something?
I do also call you on the phone. There's supposed to be a committee discussion for the 10 questions, and then I do call you on the phone also independently.
All right.
So
I think I would have remembered if we'd done this before.
maybe
I don't
so.
think
So
we-
I
don't
apologize.
think
It's a little
we have.
different.
All right,
Okay.
well, let's go. Number
Okay,
3.
Number 3. Actually, you already answered that. I put 2 and 3 together.
All right.
So 4. So 4 says who's the appropriate person, whether it was the chair or the full committee, to communicate matters. So what this means is if we found something during the audit, like we said, a control failure, and we talked to Linda about it, we talked to the commissioner about it, we talked to Mark about it, probably even Bill about it, and we all agreed there's a problem. We don't usually like to wait until July to tell you there's a problem, because that's just not good business practice. So we generally like to have some type of protocol up front of who you want us to call, all of us here, if we have a problem. So would you want us to start with Mr. Steen, or would you want us to call a special session and talk to the full board?
Oh, I think Mr. Steen.
Okay.
Thinking Mr. Stedman, but okay.
I nominate. Okay, the chair it is.
All right, that sounds fine.
All right. I hope I never have to use that, but we are required to have a protocol in place.
I'll immediately call Chairman Stedman.
Okay, okay. 5 is about allocations of responsibility. So what this is talking about is delegation of authority. So have you changed any delegation of authority down to your management team, like as to types of contracts they can approve, limits, things like that? Because that goes to our controls, making sure that the proper people have documented and signed off.
Mr. Franz, help us with this one. Because you changed since the last time you were here?
So it'd be changed during fiscal year 18.
So she's asking us, this is number 5, right?
Yes, sir.
How are responsibilities allocated between management and the AOC? And so what she's really asking, have we changed this in any significant way last year? Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm asking. Yes. That aligns with what I've been told, so, but I am required to ask.
All right.
Yeah, we talked about reviews, and we've kind of formalized that process.
Yes.
Actually, we just approved that. Did you hear that?
I did hear about that,
Okay,
yes.
so
Okay,
that's probably a good thing. That
That
may
is-
be the only change.
okay. I duly noted.
Commissioner, are you aware of anything? All right, okay.
Okay. 6 really doesn't apply to you, so I'll skip that. What that's really getting into is if you got into a new line of business, which I know you haven't. 7 is, is there a particular area of all the things we talked about, like loans, grants, debt, things like that, that anyone on the committee has a concern about from a proper presentation perspective? In other words, are the numbers correct? Do you have concern about any of that that we would need to talk about?
No. I mean, I'm not concerned, but the value of the audit, I mean, partly it's numbers,
Correct?
but it's really about your evaluation of systems and procedures. And we're looking back in time.
We are
like
looking
way back, in time for the numbers. But so, no, just your general audit stuff. It's not like this area concerns me. The area that concerns me is just systems, procedures, and those checks and balances that give us comfort.
Great, and we do incorporate that into our process. As I mentioned, that's the what we refer to as the controls over internal or financial reporting.
Right.
So we are looking at that. 8 is regarding to regulators. So any things you've had to vote on or file with like the IRS or the DOL or anybody like that who's come down here to give you some attention?
All right, and once again, you're asking the AOC whether we...
If you've had to be involved in any of those discussions.
No.
To my knowledge, there haven't been any discussions, but again, I'm required to ask.
All right,
Okay.
there's your answer. All right, next.
9 is, are you aware of any internal control that didn't work right? So a significant failure in your loan system, a significant failure in the bank processes, anything like that that would cause the financial numbers to not be correct?
No, we get these sort of detailed reports from I'm not sure, they kind of run together. I hate to say that, but in other words, like, well, this employee didn't have, I don't know, something, and so I think it's really comes from Mark Pale's group, and so I think it sounds like it's been, but yeah, these are things that pop up all the, from time to time, but nothing.
Nothing of this magnitude.
Yeah, no,
And I
nothing
actually do
material.
get to
I
look
don't
at all
think.
those reports too. So
You do?
Yes, sir, I do.
Good.
I have access
You
to
probably
those.
understand
In fact, I
them.
read them all yesterday.
No, good.
I promise.
Good. Okay, thank you.
And number 10 is what we call a catch-all. After you've seen kind of what we've talked about here and where our audit processes are, anything that you think of that we need to know about that I haven't specifically asked you a question?
See how Dan Rather ends his interviews,
It's the last question. Not at this point. I've just started my audit. Be happy to report back in July.
I think we're not aware.
Okay.
All right.
All right, so that is the end of that agenda item. There is a second agenda item that we'll wait for. I made the mistake last year of just running right into it, so.
Is that it?
Yes, there's a second agenda item about the single audit.
Oh, okay. All right, so you're queuing.
That's
that, all right.
also in our deck.
All right. The next item under internal audit is discussion of the State of Texas federal portion of the statewide single audit for the fiscal year ended August 31, 2018, report number 19-315, issued March 2019 by the Texas State Auditor's Office. This item does not require any action. Ms. Susan Warren will present this item to the committee. KPMG LLP performs this audit under contract with the State Auditor's Office. Ms. Warren.
Correct. So that report was issued back, as it mentioned, in February, and we have a tradition of bringing the results of that impacted the coordinating board to you as part of this presentation. And that's what the next slides are about, and Shannon is going to walk through those slides.
Hi, everyone. I'm first going to go through the audit findings, and then I'll go through our verbal comments. So on the first slide goes through our audit findings related to the Career and Technical Education Program. The first one relates to Cap Central HR, which was a finding at the comptroller, but affects coordinating board as payroll for career and technical education flows through that system. And this was labeled a significant deficiency due to some IT issues related to change management workflow, as well as inappropriate access. However, these issues were corrected prior to August 31st, 2018. The second item is also a significant deficiency related to allowable costs and cost principles. We had tested certain HR controls, including reviews of CAPS HR reports related to employees' certification and review of timesheets. And we had noted that the existing reviews were not performed consistently and or formally documented throughout the year. The last item related to the Career and Technical Education Program relates to matching level of effort and earmarking, and also is a significant deficiency. We noted that there were data elements from the maintenance of effort tables that were not completely and accurately included in the maintenance of effort report that was submitted to TEA, which related in the coordinating board underreporting that amount. However, there were no question costs as the maintenance of effort was met statewide. Moving on to the next slide. This goes into our audit finding related to the FELP program.
Can I stop you there?
Sure.
I mean, this is kind of a dimly lit brain cell about CAPS. I remember all that stuff, and so what happened? You know, that was the program that didn't work for us, and we kind of convinced the state that we could use our own program, except that maybe in career and technical education we didn't, and we have a bunch of problems.
Right, that's the CAPS general ledger piece that you deferred to implement. This is the actual CAPS HR piece, two separate modules that you had already implemented. So what happened during the single audit in 18 was the CAPS HR piece, the payroll processing part, became big enough statewide. And in other words, enough agencies were starting to use it to pay federal dollars through it that we brought it into scope. The comptroller's office basically houses that program and is responsible for all the change management and access. When we went to test that, they had some problems with that. They had segregation of duties issues and change management tickets that were not documented, which created significant deficiency. However, we started that audit before August year end, and so they worked diligently to correct all those situations so that we could actually audit the corrections and be able to put in the report to the federal government that although they had problems during fiscal year 18, it was corrected by year end.
This is the Perkins grant?
It does affect the Perkins grant here. That's what was in scope, but it affects, just think of it this way, it affects any federal dollar statewide that flowed through that system.
Okay.
So if you actually pull up the report, it has 25 agencies listed in it, part of this finding. You were tagged because we did audit this program that flows through it. Yes.
Don't have to be worried about this. Should
It's
we
already
be
been
worried?
fixed.
It's already been fixed.
It's already been
All right,
fixed.
then.
So it's good. It's good.
Moving on to the FELP audit finding. This was related to timely claims filings by lenders or servicers that was also tagged as a significant deficiency. We noted that the coordinating board utilizes a tracker to monitor the disposition of certain death, disability, and bankruptcy claims. And the coordinating board did not include any of these claims for the year in their tracker. Upon running a query, we noted there were 2 death claims and 1 bankruptcy claim that were identified. The 2 death claims were appropriately not filed and appropriately not included in that tracker. However, the bankruptcy claim should have been tracked until the discharge date.
And
Any other?
That's already been fixed too.
Yeah. Any other questions on those audit findings before we move on to the verbal comments?
I don't think so.
So the next slide, slide 15, talks about the verbal comments, and these items were mitigated such that the threshold for inclusion in the written report were not met, so these are just verbally communicated to you today. The first item relates to the Career and Technical Education Program related to subrecipient monitoring. We noted various elements were noted to enhance the existing subrecipient monitoring processes. However, we found that the existing practices and documentation were deemed sufficient when we were provided with some emails and explanation to bridge the gap between the control standards and the expectations. The next slide notes the IT verbal comments, slide 16. The first item is in the BMS system. We noted 7 terminated users had remained on the user listing. However, the last logon for all the users was before on the termination date of the user. The second item relates to Helms. The agency performs a periodic review of active users and user access rights to identify and remove inappropriate access. We noted that the changes were requested in June, but were not made until September. The mitigating factor for this item is that the users did not perform any inappropriate functions while having that access. The third and last item relates to EDC. We noted the Q1 user access review was performed, but the documentation of management sign-off was not retained. And the Q4 review noted 4 users to be removed, but 2 of those users were removed more than 30 days after the request. And the mitigating factor for this item is that the user access was limited to viewer only, and the access was not considered inappropriate, although it was not restricted effectively.
Any questions on the verbal comments?
Overall, on this statewide audit, is there anything that we ought to be concerned about going forward?
No, sir. These findings were, the comptroller finding was probably the most significant, but as we mentioned, it's already been corrected because it was of such a nature that it affected multiple agencies. The other 2 are really more about COSO and enhancement of controls, which is, if you actually picked up the statewide report and read it, almost every agency had similar controls because the standards changed. And so this was the year that it fully got audited under the new standards. But your team has already worked to correct all of this. So there's nothing here to worry about going forward.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Warren.
Thank you.
Ms. Canals.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate your good work. Thank you. The last item under internal audit is an update on internal reports and activities. This item does not require any action. Mr. Mark Pale, Director of Internal Audit and Compliance, will present this item to the committee and be available for questions. And Mr. Pale, we're running pretty much over our time here, so how long is your presentation?
I will be as expeditious as possible, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
And actually, on this first item, that was part of my comments, is I'm going to go through the internal audit update pretty quickly to allow a little bit more time for the compliance monitoring results. For internal audit, you have 4 reports in your packet. The first 3 reports related to prior issues and follow-ups in those areas, and noted some areas where continuing implementation is needed. And then there was 1 report that closed out a complaint that was referred to us from the state auditor's office. The complaint was partially substantiated regarding the need for the agency to better direct loan customers to the appropriate website. In essence, what you had was a website link on a loan document that pointed customers to a correct but less than optimal website. And so some changes were made. The link on the loan document has been updated to point customers to the most direct and appropriate website link to correct that issue. And that concludes my update on the internal audit side. I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide more information. I know that was extremely brief.
That was very succinct. Thank you. Any questions or comments? All right. So, and that's it for the internal.
Internal audit, yes.
All right. And so,
yes, sir.
The first item under compliance monitoring is an update on compliance monitoring reports and activities. This item does not require any action. Mr. Mark Pale will present this item to the committee and be available for questions. And I just remind everybody, this is the one where we had some written testimony that we deferred to this
That is
section.
correct. I think you have a document at your place that was provided in accordance with the procedures. You know, it's up to the chair as to whether you would like to have that. I think previously, in the last meeting when we had something like that, you had that read into the record.
Would we do that now?
We could certainly do that now.
All right. Or did you want to do anything to preface it, or just do it right off the bat?
I can't remember last time if we did it before or after my presentation. I'd be happy to go through my
Well,
presentation.
I'll go ahead, and can I ask for a volunteer to read this? It's not very long. Ms. Strawn, would you read it? Okay. And what I'm looking at is, it's this written testimony you see at the bottom. It says, "Dear THECB Agency Committee and THECB Administration." So.
Yes. So, dear THECB Agency Committee and THECB Administration, this letter is in reference to the investigations recently concluded at Coastal Bend College. I write this letter from my personal board trustee point of view and do not speak on behalf of the college board. I would like to extend my gratitude for the representatives of THECB for their tireless work at our college during this last year. Though investigations are not generally favored, it is appreciated that our college is able to work with THECB on rectifying our processes. I commend the THECB for your efforts in remaining transparent and keeping me involved in the process for the professionalism of the audit team. The college has already started to work on our corrective action plan, and the progress is publicly displayed in our board meeting agendas. Please know, as a trustee for Coastal Bend College, I take my governance role seriously, and I will continue to advocate for the betterment of our college. I look forward to working with THECB in the days ahead. Sincerely, Dela Castillo, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Dela Castillo, Board of Trustee, Place 1.
Thank you, Ms. Strawn. Go ahead, Mr. Pale.
Thank you. And I'll come back to, there's actually 2 reports that I want to call your attention to. One of them is UT Permian Basin, but since we just talked about Coastal Bend College, I'll continue with those comments first. I would like to address our Perkins investigation report at Coastal Bend College that was issued last month that you have in your materials. Perkins is a federal grant program that is the primary federal funding source for career and technical education. Our Perkins investigation at Coastal Bend College resulted in question costs of $182,000, comprised of 2 main elements. Payroll expenses of $160,000 were questioned due to recurring noncompliance issues associated with charges to the grant. Time and effort reports were not signed by the employee and/or the supervisor, and notations were made of activities that were unable to be substantiated as grant-related. The other piece of the $182,000 was equipment expenses of $22,000 were questioned due to loss and failure to report the loss in a timely manner. We also noted a lack of a policy when equipment was repurposed for other non-grant use. So those two elements comprise the $182,000. Commissioner Paredes and I met with the CBC board last week to discuss our investigation results. There was a productive dialogue regarding the issues, and since that time, the CBC board voted to repay the $182,000 in question costs, and I received information today that has actually been received by the agency, so the repayment has been made. Two final points I'd like to leave you with, and then certainly can answer questions, because I know the report is a pretty meaty document, so if there's specific questions, I'll be happy to respond. First, CBC has a history of recurring findings in this area. In fact, we determined that CBC repaid the coordinating board $30,000 in Perkins funds from a prior desk review conducted by the coordinating board in 2014. For 2 years thereafter, in 2015 and 2016, the institution was cited for noncompliance with time and effort reporting. And each year, CBC provided a corrective action plan to address the noted deficiencies. The present investigation report shows marked recidivism and is the primary reason to place Coastal Bend College under heightened monitoring going forward for the Perkins grant. Second point I would like to leave you with is that the CBC management responses that are incorporated into the final report are concerning. The responses indicate a fundamental lack of understanding of the Perkins grant. Management's response emphasized that employees were budgeted 100% to the Perkins grant, and therefore time and effort reporting was not required, missing the point that evidence indicated that employees were working some percentage of their time on non-grant related activities. So the response didn't line up with the evidence that was discussed as we concluded or shared our results from the project. The Perkins grant requires that payroll expenses must be substantiated by after-the-fact reporting to confirm that work time budgeted for the grant was actually used, was applied to the grant. So both of these points were shared with the CBC board in our meeting that we conducted last Tuesday evening. That is a short summary of that work at Coastal Bend College on the Perkins grant investigation, and I'll be happy to respond, or I don't know, Commissioner, if you had anything that you would like to add based on our meeting.
No, I went because I went to Beeville with Mark because we had reason to think that the Board of Trustees and the institutional leadership would not be receptive to our concerns, and it turned out that my concerns ultimately were unjustified. They were responsive, and they did seem to recognize that this was a very serious situation, had been recurring, and I felt satisfied with the outcomes.
Did you show them this email? I couldn't believe it. The one in your report.
That redacted document is actually part of the record.
I mean, you presented that to them in your meeting, and how did they react?
You know, I think for several things, including that, it was, I think it was eye-opening is the way I'd characterize it. You know, they seemed very interested and had lots of questions, both in the public setting and then in executive session. So they were very much in tune with the concerns.
Good.
How much of your meeting was in open session and how much was in executive session?
I don't know the exact number of minutes, but it was split roughly 50-50, I would say. I want to say 30 to 40 minutes maybe open and something like that in executive.
And you used the phrase heightened monitoring. What does that mean?
That means the federal government and really good grant management principles require or suggest that if a grantee is exhibiting certain characteristics that make them more risky, that if you continue to fund that grantee forward, that you place additional monitoring on the recipient of those funds to ensure that that those concerns or those risk factors are very closely watched. And so what it will mean going forward is that our function will be working very closely with the coordinating board's personnel that are responsible for that grant, and we will develop specific procedures. For example, with time and effort reporting, what we found in the investigation was that we really couldn't trust the documentation that was received, because we received documentation that, at least at face value, appeared to have been altered or perhaps produce one set for the auditors, and then there's another set that exists that is different, that the time and effort numbers are different on the same report for the same time period. So going forward, what we'll want to do is actually interview those personnel that are charging time to the grant to directly ask the question, what did you do over the last month, 6 weeks, whatever that time period ends up being, and so that we get the direct evidence that what we're seeing in the documentation agrees with what's actually occurring at the institution. So it's a much more rigorous, much more interactive, involved kind of oversight of the grant. So it will definitely impact our function, and it will impact Dr. Rex Peebles and his group that manage the grant.
In terms of their board, are there going to be continuing communications with the board?
We do not have anything on the books right now. Now, what we would have is we would have, as any report is issued by my function, there will be, that will continue to be provided to their board. And, and we made it clear in the presentation to their board that we were available informally, certainly, to answer any questions, to provide additional information, and that door is certainly being kept open.
Did you get any assurances from the board like this will not happen again?
I think the assurance that we got is that they were taking this very seriously. I don't know that they used the words that this won't happen again. I think that they made statements that they were very concerned.
In my comments to the board, both in public and executive session, I said that probably the issue regarding this investigation that was most concerning to me was the seeming lack of urgency by the leadership of the institution. There seemed to be more interest in contesting the findings with data and information that wasn't reliable, and simply not seeming to be terribly troubled by it, by the information that we had provided them. So I think that changed at that meeting, both in public and in executive session.
Do you think that changed?
I think the attitude of the board changed. I think they did develop a sense of urgency during those two meetings.
Any other questions or comments?
I did have the one other institution that I wanted to briefly, before I conclude, our work at UT Permian Basin. just because the dollar amount was pretty high as well. On that project, we questioned, this was another federal grant, teacher quality. We questioned $187,000 in cost. Roughly 2/3 of those costs were payroll-related costs that either lacked sufficient documentation or that did not comply with the federal requirements for time and effort for personnel who were charged to the grant. On that project, we worked with the institution in terms of their understanding of the issues and of certainly putting a corrective action plan in place, the repayment of the funds. And so there's one piece of that project that's still outstanding, and there were 2 periods for the grant. The second, more current period is being evaluated by that institution's internal auditor. So we will be working with them to determine their results and see if there's any additional question costs, but 187 for the portion that we did and reported on.
Any questions or comments? That's it, Mr. Bell. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Outstanding work as usual. Yeah. So now I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. I believe that's next. It's Dr. Farias and Mr. Stedman. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The meeting's adjourned. Thank you.